The US has a lot going for it, but innovating within our democratic systems is something we're a little bit behind compared to other countries, right, in terms of our experimentation.
Karthick, welcome to 12 Geniuses. Why don't you start out by telling us about your journey to America? You came here when you were 12 years old. What was that journey like?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I am an immigrant to America. I grew up in South India, in Bangalore. We moved to Canada and then the US in search of opportunity, as I think many immigrants do when they come to the United States.
What does the American dream mean to you? Or how do you define the American dream?
This is a rich question, right? The American dream is something that is, I think, very individual and personal to a lot of people, but it is also part of the founding of this country, right? Now, that said, it is a little complicated because part of the founding of this country was the instance of people fleeing religious persecution, right? That's an important part of that story, right? As a haven for refugees, if you will, right? People who felt oppression where they were and wanted to come to a new place, to start anew and to have the freedom to be, right? That is just a powerful, animating feature of what America is about. It's complicated because there were Native Americans here. And so it was not a land that was free of people. You know, at the time you had a lot of these philosophers that talked about the state of nature and just thought of Native Americans as part of nature. They didn't own property and therefore we could do whatever we wanted in this country. So that's the complicated part. But still, that animating spirit is one of seeking freedom and the ability to thrive and to be who you are. So that is true even today. It is seen as a land of opportunity, and a lot of it is because of the freedom and the ability to free yourself from a lot of the traditional constraints, right? Say in Europe, that kept society and the economy from doing as much as it could. You know, that was not necessarily the case in America, that you could write new rules and you could do new things. And that's why even today, when you look at entrepreneurs in America, this is why you see so many immigrants as entrepreneurs. That is part of the American dream. Now, later when we talk about democracy, you know, I'll say that some of that spirit of innovation and trying things new, it exists in many parts of the economy and even in parts of society. But when it comes to our political institutions, I think it's what we have seen, and, I'm trained as a political scientist, and part of my training was looking at different countries and their political systems. The US has a lot going for it, but innovating within our democratic systems is something we're a little bit behind compared to other countries, right, in terms of our experimentation.
I want to ask you what your definition of democracy is.
Democracy is a system where the people decide. In the context of the US, you have direct democracy, like in California, Washington State, many Western states have systems of direct democracy that sit alongside representative democracy. Right? So you can put up a question and the people decide.
These are the propositions.
Propositions, right. So you get to write law in many of these states, or even the Constitution in many of these states. You can amend the Constitution through ballot propositions. But the dominant form of democracy that we have in the US and many other parts of the world is representative democracy, right? Where you elect a set of people and you expect them to reflect your wishes, but you also expect them to use their best judgment and skills to make the right decision. And then you will have some regular interval to vote them out of office. Now, nothing in this definition of democracy says anything about parties. And in fact, when the founders came up with our version of democracy, they did not have the language to talk about parties. The closest you see in the Federalist Papers is talk of faction, right? Already you were seeing that there were some differences of opinion that were emerging, but there was nothing in the form of a party. But then subsequently, parties arose, and this is a really fascinating story when you look at it. When you ask how did political parties come about, and turns out that they came about in Congress. Like that's where the political party system first started, because you had these members that had their, you had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but they weren't parties. They had a general orientation. It was when they had to come together to pass laws, and they found that, you know what, there's a certain set of people that consistently feel like they're voting in the same way across issue areas. And so you started to see the formation of parties, the Jeffersonian Republicans, for example, right, as the start of the party system. So it started as a, back then in America, democracy was an elite affair. You need to be a white male owning property to participate. And even then, a lot of the decisions were being made in Congress. And so that where you saw a lot of what happens in democracy was in that representative body. Later on, with the rise of the mass party system, so Andrew Jackson is part of that, Martin Van Buren, and then it continues after that, is as they expand the vote, the franchise, you start getting parties out in the electorate, right? And parties develop platforms, they develop identities. And so a lot of democracy, which is not only about the ability to vote people in and out, but to have competing choices, comes about, and it gets structured over time with the political party system.
Yeah, it seems to me that the parties were created for efficiency's sake, and now we use them exclusively for efficiency and to use them really to decide for us or think for us. And that's where things get a little dangerous. And so maybe that's a jumping off point to your opinions around why American democracy has been so enduring.
Yeah, there are a few kind of factors at play here, right? So one, you can look at the I guess, it's the 12 Genius Project. You can look at the genius of the founders, right? In terms of thinking about how they want to design something that can serve the immediate purpose they had, which is to build a stronger government. So this goes beyond the Declaration, right? So you look at the Constitution, right? Build a Constitution that overcomes a lot of the limitations that they found with the, with their first attempt at this kind of confederacy arrangement. And so part of the strength of democracy is building stronger institutions than just a loose collection of states trying to figure something out and having a very weak national government. But having that in balance with thinking about states and the importance that states play, right? So federalism is part of that story of what has made American democracy resilient over time. Federalism has been one of those kind of safety valve mechanisms where you don't put all the power in the federal government, but you don't put all the power in state government either. So it's that balance that has helped our country, stand the test of time, right? Or at least our political system stand the test of time. But you also have what they call civil society, right? So this is de Tocqueville, when he comes to America in the early 1800s. He comes from France, and he thinks he wants to understand American democracy, especially for what it could mean for France. And instead of paying attention to the formal institutions, he is really struck by all of the robust kind of voluntary associations and civic life in America, right? And all of the different clubs, the religious institutions that make democracy work at the local level. And so that's an important part of the democracy story that very few people talk about, because when we think about democracy, we think about voting, we think about political institutions. And this is where I think technology comes in too, right? When you look at virtual communities, are they the same as, the bowling leagues and the Rotary clubs and the chambers of commerce? Yeah, maybe some pieces of it, but often what you're seeing now, if you can have these things like support groups, absolutely. But what you're finding in online communities is what you're also finding more generally in our media landscape, which is strong polarization by ideology and kind of centralization, right? You have a few big players that are really, if not controlling, at least channeling a lot of the information flow that happens. And we're creating, or at least we see the conditions for really strong social divisions that are hard to bridge now. So, for example, if you look at the media landscape, news media is an important part of democracy. And when you look at the thousands of newspapers that have gone out of business in the last 2 decades, that has really been a challenge for our local democracy, because now citizens don't know what's going on in City Hall. They don't know what's going on in county government. And even in the places where those newspapers exist, most of the news content is national news and some state news, right? And when you have strong partisanship at the national level and the state level, that does very little to tell you what kind of problems need to be solved at the local level, right? And so that becomes challenging, and that's one of the things to try to figure out is how do you build a robust press, or at least local information environment that can support local democracy and local decision making and problem solving. That's something I would say in terms of the state of American democracy. We seem to have lost a big chunk of our ability to solve problems.
I don't disagree. I want to ask you about the flourishing of Americans, because I believe personally that we live in a world of abundance. You live in a world of abundance. I live in a world of abundance. Not every citizen in the world does, but we're on the precipice of creating abundance for all 8 billion people. That's what I truly believe. And I believe democracy is critical and has been critical for creating this abundance, or this flourishing of Americans, flourishing in Western Europe and throughout the world. Why is it that democracy has been so critical to creating this abundance or this flourishing nature?
Yeah, well, let's get into this, right? I mean, I think you make a passionate plea for it, and I think it has a lot going for it. But there are people in this world, leaders and even countries, that have different theories about how you get communities to thrive, right? So if you look at the model in China, for example, right, you can call it communism, but largely it's state-controlled capitalism, right? And so you have a lot of restrictions, both on the business side of things as well as on individual liberties. But the bargain seems to be that, if you're able to pick up the trash, if you're able to keep the cities clean, I mean, this is the Singapore model too, right? That if you're able to provide these things, like, people don't need to vote, they don't need to decide who their leaders are. If you just provide people what they need and maintain social order, then you don't need to worry about the political system and to allow democracy to happen.
I don't disagree, but let me just push back a little bit, because abundance might mean affluence, and I'm really more interested in flourishing, which is you have a place to rest your head. You can go to school if you want to go to school, but you have choices around who you are, freedom to choose. I think that's a really, really important and critical part to America's success and democracy's success, as opposed to China or maybe some other countries who have done well financially around the world.
Yeah, no, but I think that's where, it's good that we're digging into what does it mean to thrive and what does it mean to flourish, right? Is it just about meeting those basic needs, or even those higher end needs?
We should be beyond that. I know, in 2024.
Yeah, but even say those higher end needs, some people might think of those luxuries, But what you're pointing out to is the ability to choose, right? Is a fundamental aspect of what it means to flourish, right?
Yes.
And so yes, if that is in the definition, absolutely, you need to have a robust democracy in order for that to happen. Now, it doesn't mean, right? So even in the democratic system that we have, part of the reason why we have representative democracy is that, people might not be the best suited to decide on everything. So, for example, what should the interest rate in the United States be? It's not clear that you and I are the best situated to make that decision. But a big part of American democracy that de Tocqueville talks about is also our sense of obligation to each other. It's not just the freedoms. Because if you have freedoms without any sense of obligation and commitment, right, then it just becomes a free-for-all. You don't really build a robust society when you do that.
Yeah. And democracy is a contact sport. It has to be a contact sport. There has to be responsibility. There has to be duty involved in there. It's not a like watching television where it's one directional. It has to be two directional or multi-directional.
Yeah, it is not a spectator sport, and it is not something that you cast your ballot and you're done and you just walk away, right? It does require people's engagement. The thing I would say, I think you mentioned we're at the 248th year. In 2 years, we'll be at the 250th. So a lot of people are thinking about how do we commemorate American democracy and what it's meant. I'm thinking about the next century, the next 250 years, right?
Same.
Yeah. And what I would say is, so this is an idea I've had, I would say, for about 4 or 5 years now. And it's this idea of thinking about a companion document to the Declaration of Independence and to think about a declaration of interdependence.
Oh, I like that. Talk more about this.
So this notion of interdependence, the Declaration of Independence was heavily built on John Locke and kind of liberal theory from Europe. That's where that comes from. And it kind of just swept aside anything about native knowledge and this sense of community and interdependence between each other. A lot of it is about property and contracts and, I've got my piece and society will be better off if everyone has their piece, right? And then you have Adam Smith with the invisible hand, everything will work out. And we've known for a while that everything doesn't always work out, right? You have negative externalities like pollution. You have other things like, especially say with climate change, there are things each individual might do where the collective, where society gets harmed as a result. But we haven't had this notion of interdependence, and that's something that has been foundational to native societies, not just in the US, but elsewhere. It's also been fundamental to so many European traditional cultures. This notion that our fates are interlinked. This, to me, came up powerfully during the pandemic. The reason why I have to worry about being sick is not just what happens to me, but the fact that I might get you sick and that you might die. Right? That notion of interdependence. You see that in terms of our planet. We would love to just grow as much as possible and not worry and maybe blame other countries that are not doing enough to address their pollution targets. But we only got one planet, at least for now. Right. I don't know how many people are going to be living in Mars, so we have to figure this out. But I say this as a companion document because, of course, that individual liberty and freedom is core to what it takes to succeed and thrive. But if you don't have that sense of interdependence, that's when you potentially, devolve into individual selfishness and not caring at all about the kind of community that you're building. So that's my hope. And I hope that we can be future looking and that we can be authors of our future, right? Think like the founders. They were futurists. They didn't know what America would look like 20, 30, 100 years from then. But they did the best they could to create a system, that could bring the best out of all of us.
I love that. Let's end on this. Where do you see America's democracy being most vulnerable?
Our information environment is both fragmented and polarized, and also disconnected from the day-to-day lived experience of people in the communities where they live, where they work, where they recreate, where they go to church, and that is worrisome, because when you don't have that fundamental set of bearings about what are the problems that we face, but what are the solutions that we need to have, when we don't have the ability to have that problem-solving mindset and working with people no matter what their backgrounds or beliefs might be, that makes it very difficult. So America has, for centuries, had this reputation of being very pragmatic, very solutions-oriented, and not being so stuck on ideology that you think you know all the answers. But now we have a media environment, and not just what's on television or radio, but a lot of it what's on our screens, where we can just be in our own little thought bubbles and feel like what's most important is to maintain the boundaries of our tribe, as it were, as opposed to solve our problems.
Karthik, this is a great place to stop. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being a genius.
Thank you for having me.